friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today is going to be my June wrap-up talking about all of the books that I read in the month of June. Now I definitely slowed down. I have 18 books in total to talk about, but 4 of those are DNF, so I technically finished 14 books, which is much less than the 29 that I finished last month, but I'm fine with that. Unfortunately, a lot of these were average, a lot of 3-star average books that will ultimately be quite forgettable for me. There's a couple standouts, and because this month was so low, instead of categorizing them in genres, I'm just gonna go from ranking. So I'll start with my DNFs and then go from least favorite to most favorite book. So let's get the duds out of the way. The first book that I did not finish this month is The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, a few years back, I read Station 11 and really enjoyed it. It was a very unique read. I read it when the pandemic was happening. I gave it 5 stars. In hindsight, giving it a few years, it is definitely not a favorite read, and there were stuff that I didn't love in the book. But at that time that I read it, it was very intriguing. And so I wanted to give another one of the author's books a try. I just could not get into this one. The story started off with a pair of siblings, and the guy is like into drugs and is trying to get his life together, and then the sister's kind of like trying to take care of him but also trying to live her own life and do her own thing. And then their dad gets a job at this mysterious hotel, and there's this weird businessman who's wandering the woods. It was all just a bit random, and I could not care about it enough to want to continue reading. So unfortunately this one didn't really work for me, and I honestly have no interest in reading her new one, even though it's getting a lot of rave reviews. It is way too weird and like speculative, I think, for me to like it. I heard it's hard to explain and it's very confusing, and none of that sounds appealing to me. The next book that just did not work for me this month was The Orchard by Christina Gorcheva Newberry. This is a new release that I first spotted on the shelves in Powell, and this beautiful cover with watercolor foliage and fruit drew me in. And then I opened the flap and realized that this was a book about a Soviet experience, which I'm like so about. I'm like really drawn to that. And the parts that did include that Soviet experience, I loved. But the heart of the story is 2 best friends who are really like sisters, and it's their coming of age story. And I really don't like coming of age stories, I'm realizing, at least not in literary fiction. Maybe in middle grade and maybe some YA, but not in literary fiction, because for this reason, I don't want to make assumptions that most literary fiction is this way, but this one felt this way because there's completely unnecessary and overuse of very crude and vulgar description of sex. And like these girls were just obsessed with their bodies and obsessed with sex, and it's like, okay, I get it, you're coming of age, you're figuring out your sexuality, but like I don't want to read about it. And the amount of times that the author included words like pubic hair and tits, I was like, ugh, I'm not interested. Like, you are pulling me out of the story. This is a really good example of why I don't love literary fiction, because in my mind's eye, a lot of literary fiction includes this like obsession with sex for some reason, which I don't want to read about. The next 2 books that I DNF'd were unfortunately anticipated releases for me, so I had like high hopes. I was excited about them, but they just didn't work for me. The Saints of Swallow Hill by Donna Everhart. I was first drawn to the story because it was promised to be historical fiction set in North Carolina following the turpentine industry, and I don't really know anything about that. I haven't read too many books set in North Carolina, but again, this like weird obsession with sex I don't want to read about. The opening chapters of the story is just about a man who's a big womanizer, and just you were in his mind hearing about how he's thinking about these women and how he wants to sleep with them, and they're all married women, and he's trying to like get laid just to get laid. It's like a score sheet for him. And then he's like talking about this black woman, and he's like, I've never been with a it's just all of this weird gross language. I didn't make it very far into this one because I could not move past that, and I was like, oh, if this is setting a tone for the book and this character and his mindset, I'm not interested. And then the final book that I abandoned this month is The Woman in the Library. This book I really tried. I think I got about 30% of the way through too. Honestly, this book was just way too confusing. It was a book within a book within a book. So the present storyline is that you just get this person who is writing letters to an author, and they are reading her book. And then the alternating chapters are that book that this person is reading. And in that story, there are 4 characters in the Boston Library who become friends, and they hear a woman scream, and then she was murdered, and then they are all writers writing books in that library. And so it's then the stories that they're writing and their relationship. It was confusing. It was weird. There were too many characters, not enough development. It felt really messy. And I just feel like the editor or someone just needed to tell this author to like take it back a notch and rework it. All right, let's pick it up, but continue the rants, because next least favorite book that I actually did finish, just because it was really short, is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This was on my classics to read this year. The audiobook that is narrated by Maggie Gyllenhaal is a great audiobook. I just could care less about this story. And again, I think it's because it's literary fiction. At this point, this is considered a classic, but at the time it was written, it was really like an early work of feminist literary fiction. I just realized that I do not care about this sad girl vibe. I just don't care to read about depressed women's stories. They are not compelling to me for the reason they are compelling to other people. I don't mind reading about mental health representation in books. Maybe I actually prefer it in nonfiction, like a story of someone's real experience. But in a fictionalized world, it just, I don't know, I just don't want to sit in it. I don't mind reading sad books, but there needs to be some sort of hope and redemption, character arc, growth from that experience, but there just wasn't in this book. This is about a girl in college and her relationships with her friends, losing her virginity, and then in the midst of all that, her career, and then she gets depressed, moves back home, gets put into a mental institution, gets electroshock therapy, and is just sad. And the book just kind of ends with just her life, and that's it. And you're like, what did I just read? And what was the point of that? No offense to anyone that loves this book or loves this author, but I'm just realizing what I like and don't like in books, and this sad girl energy is just not what I'm vibing with. The next book that I ended up giving 3 stars to, but it was really like a 2.5, Tia Nonman, 1989, Our Shattered Hopes. This is a graphic novel that I actually started reading on the 1st of May because of Asian American Heritage Month, and this graphic novel put me in a reading slump off of graphic novels, which are usually the books that get me out of reading slumps, but for some reason this one just put me in it and I couldn't finish it, and it literally took me like 2 months to finish. The art style was fine. It's just that this was a nonfiction graphic novel about the events that led up to this revolution in China in 1989 and what was happening in Tiananmen Square. There's a picture of a tank and a man in that square that I'm aware of that picture, but I'm not aware of any of the events. So I wanted to read this for that kind of knowledge, but I didn't really gain enough to take away from this. I don't know. It wasn't bad, but as far as graphic novels go, and as far as nonfiction graphic novels that are explaining a historical event, this one just wasn't my favorite. Next up for enjoyment level, I have a 2.5 stars, and that is Commonwealth by Anne Patchett. This was on my summer TBR, and an author that I've been meaning to try forever. And I buddy read this with the wonderful Jolene from A Bookworm Adventure Girl, and we had an incredible buddy reading experience. And if anything, I enjoyed this book more because of that experience. But taking a look back, this is another example of literary fiction that I, dipped my toe in and I didn't really love because ultimately not too much happened. This is a family story about a broken family, multiple step parents, multiple children, and it really jumps back and forth in timeline all over the place with telling little pockets and little moments in random characters' lives. It could be the dad and then the stepfather and then this kid and then this kid and then something they experienced. And in the end, the author kind of tied it together, but it felt very underwhelming, like we were working up to something and that something just didn't exist. And so ultimately this was just, here's a family and here's some stuff that happened and how one person's actions affected another person's actions, and this just is what it is. I unfortunately just didn't really love any of the characters. I wasn't drawn into the family. I wasn't rooting for anyone. I wasn't invested in the story. This was a very unique reading experience, and I thought it was well written to a certain point that I am more than happy to try more of Anne Patchett's work. But as far as this particular story goes, I just really didn't love it enough. But I will say that it made for a good buddy read because there was a lot to unpack. Next up, I read 2 nonfictions that are both falling in the middle of the road for me. 3 stars. The first one is Stiff by Mary Roach. This is a book that has been on my nonfiction TBR for a while, one of the first books that I purchased since starting BookTube, and I'm glad I finally got to it. But again, this wasn't as impactful as I was expecting it to be. I much prefer Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty, which is a book about working in the crematorium and her experiences with death and bodies and embalming and all that kind of stuff. That was just more of like a narrative nonfiction experience that was really fun to read. This one felt a little bit more dry at times, and it went all over the board with cadavers, which is maybe what you're expecting when you're getting into a book that's all about cadavers. This book is also older. I think it's written in 2003, so I feel like a lot of stuff in here wasn't new or surprising to me based on maybe shows that I've watched or books that I've already read that have to do with this industry. Another one I liked but didn't love All Things Bright and Beautiful by James Herriot. Picked this up for Buzzwordathon because all is in the title. And this is a continuation of the story I read All Creatures Great and Small a couple months back. Enjoyed it for the most part. I had a bit of a roller coaster ride with that one, but it ended strong, and so I gave that book 4 stars. This one landed on 3, and I think it solidified that I don't need to continue this series. I think it's like a 5 or 6 book series. This whole series is about James Herriot's experience as a vet in Yorkshire, England, and dealing with farm animals, and it's really well told. Each chapter is like a little separate story, but I realized that I lived for the chapters that didn't have anything to do with the animals and that touched on his personal life, his relationship with his boss and his wife, and different interactions he had with farmers. Those were funny and really memorable and sweet. And then everything in between about his actual diagnosing of certain conditions and dealing with farm animals, and a lot of very detailed descriptive work of what's going on in the farm animal. I don't really care to read about those stories, and that's the majority of this book. I'm much more interested in the PBS show because I think that'll be a little bit more fun. The next book that fell somewhere in the 3.5 star range for me is The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary. Since I began my journey last month with reading my first romantic comedy ever and enjoyed that, I now want to sprinkle in a few here and there because they are fun to read, and this was no exception. About 2 people who share an apartment and then they end up falling in love, and I like their individual backgrounds and stories for the most part. A little bit of it felt silly, and the side characters were also a bit random sometimes, but it was an enjoyable read. The next 3 I'll touch on are all historical fictions. The first one is Florence Adler Swims Forever by Rachel Beemland. This was also on my summer TBR last year and this year, and I also got to buddy read this with a wonderful viewer and commenter, Jane. Again, this book made for a good buddy read because this was historical fiction but also felt very literary at the same time. This book focuses on a particular Jewish family that lives in Atlantic City right before World War II breaks out, and different chapters focus on different characters in this family, and they are all dealing with grief in their own ways. And at the end of the day, I liked the story, but it also felt like too much was happening. There were too many perspectives and too many characters. The little parts and nuggets that I cared about the most weren't unpacked enough. A historical fiction that I was expecting to be a 5-star read, but unfortunately was not, is Secrets of a Charmed Life by Susan Meisner. I had high hopes for this one. I loved her book, Nature of Fragile Things, last year. One of my absolute favorites, and a lot of people loved this book and rated it pretty high. I think I landed on 3.5 stars as well. This book is primarily about a young woman who's 16 when World War II breaks out, and her and her sister are sent off to the countryside, but she really wants to be her own woman. She wants to be an adult. She wants to grow up. She doesn't want to be treated like a kid, and so she ended up going back into town right as the Blitz happened, gets separated from her family, and has to deal with the ramifications of the Blitz and the war and everything that's going on. At the heart of the story, the book is about secrets, and that's another thing I realized, I think a couple months back, but this just solidified it for me, is I hate a book about secrets. I hate it. It's the miscommunication trope. It's like, just freaking talk to each other, tell each other, and all of your problems are solved and life is easier. But that's also coming from a millennial perspective, living in the time that I'm living in. People just didn't divulge everything back then, and they didn't really share everything emotionally that was going on in their minds and their hearts. So yeah, I liked it, didn't love it, but it didn't put me off Susan Meisner. I will definitely be trying more of her books. Another historical fiction that was a little bit more positive was The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson. This story is about a young woman that is living in Kentucky and is part of the Pack Horse Library Project. So she delivers books to people in the Appalachian Mountains that are really hard to get to, and she happens to be one of the blue people. It's actually based on real people. They had a medical blood condition that tinted their skin blue. I looked it up after reading this book. I was like, did this really happen? Is there actual people that look like this? And they were in fact like fully blue people. But anyways, so she is a blue woman, and she goes about her life delivering library books. But this story has a lot of grief in it. There's a lot of heartache because there's some intense sexual abuse that happens in the story that's very sad, and she's very mistreated and looked down on. She's considered colored by the white community in that area, and everyone thinks that she's weird and like a disease, except for one young man that lives in the area too, and they develop a romantic relationship. This book I think also landed on 3.5 stars. It was good. I enjoyed it. I just feel like I didn't get enough of it, and it kind of ended a bit crazy. So I wish there was more to the story. I wanted more of the developing romance, and also that experience of a mother in those first years after some events that happened in this book. I wanted more from it than what I got, but it wasn't bad by any means. I'm glad I finally read it. Next up, I have 2 graphic novels to talk about. So like I mentioned, I had that one graphic novel that just like put me off all graphic novels, but then I read these 2 and I'm so glad I did, because now I'm back into the mood to read more graphic novels. This first one is Putin's Russia: The Rise of a Dictator by Daryl Cunningham. This was a very interesting graphic novel. I will say the art style is not my favorite at all. It's very, I don't know if crude is the right word, but it's just, it feels very like meme-y, almost like a meme, you know? Not very like stylistic or beautiful. And then also, I don't know if this is more because it's topical and it has to do with Russia and what's going on right now, but this nonfiction was a lot more compelling and interesting to read than the one about China was. I don't think it's because I didn't want to read about China and wanted to read about Russia, but this had a little bit maybe more focus, and so I was interested in that focus. It's all about Putin's life, and I think for a graphic novel biography on his life and the things that he accomplished and how he got to where he is now and what he's doing, this is a great book for that. Instead of reading like a fat big historical biography, this graphic novel just did the job for me to understand this man a little bit more and why he is the way he is and what's happening right now. It gave really good context, so if you're interested in that, I would recommend. On the other hand, this graphic novel was the most stunning, I think, graphic novel that I have ever read in terms of art style. I love this graphic novel not only for the illustrations, which the color palette is beautiful, but this is a very lovely redemptive story. It follows a young pianist and his deep dive into stardom and becoming famous, and all of the terrible things that came about that really kind of shed a light of what maybe being a celebrity is like. And it's also an older man like reliving his story and reliving his life, and then in the end it kind of comes full circle. It feels very redemptive in a similar way that Kite Runner was. I will give a huge warning though that there is very explicit sex in this book and very explicit drug use, and that is illustrated. There's nudity in this book, so approach cautiously if you avoid those kinds of things. But that kind of stuff didn't bother me because it worked with the story and it told that redemption story really well. And another wonderful note is that at the end of this book, there is a QR code that you could scan in Spotify, and there's a main theme song at the end of this book that you can actually listen to, that the actual like piano music of it, which is such an amazing touch. The creators of this graphic novel just really like hit all the marks, which was amazing. Since we're in the 4-star territory, I will talk about these next 2, which I considered like good spiritual reads. This first one was Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. I picked this one up because Krista from Books and Jams was hosting a read along in the month of June, and I was able to join her for a couple lives where we talked about this book. This is a book all about looking at the heart of Christ and who he is, and I really like this one. Wasn't my favorite spiritual nonfiction. I found it to be a little bit more theologically dense than I was sometimes ready for, and a little bit more heavy in that than practical, and I tend to love a good practical spiritual nonfiction book because I'm a practical gal and I need someone to tell me what to do rather than just like an idea that I need to understand. But I found it very helpful for me to unpack some things. I found myself sometimes approaching it with a wall and a roadblock, and that is something that I had to look at inside of me to be like, why is this hard to read right now? So overall, still really enjoyed it, but I know that most people absolutely love it. I just maybe didn't love it as much as everyone else. And this next one really surprised me. It's actually a poetry collection, and it is not outright Christian or spiritual in any kind of way, but it's called How to Love the World: Poems of Gratitude and Hope. This was a very positive read, and so I think I found my sweet spot with poetry, because if you've watched some previous wrap-ups, sometimes they don't always work for me. Sometimes they feel a little bit pretentious, but not the case here. Not every poem was amazing, but a lot of the poems in here just touched on nature and love and hope and family and little moments of being with your kids or being with someone you love, or just walking around outside and like noticing a moment. And there were also parts that were broken up throughout where it had a moment of reflection. So it like broke down the poem that you just read and then had a question for you, if you're into journaling, for you to think back on that moment. And it really tried to focus on like presence. Be present in your life and notice the things around you and find joy in all the little things. And this is a library copy, but I would happily go out and buy this and just have this and look back on and reflect on. So if you are a poetry lover, which I know a few of you are, I would highly recommend this one. And finally, to end on the most positive note, with a book that I truly loved. I couldn't quite give it 5 stars, but it came pretty close, and that is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. First of all, love this color. It just screams summer, and it's just fun and quirky. The bright colors are wonderful. Like, this is a good historical fiction cover. This book is a new release, and it's been getting some hype, and I think it's well deserved. This book follows a young woman named Elizabeth Zott, and she is a chemist, and we follow her entire kind of career trajectory and what happened in her life. Her romantic pursuits, her career, her life as a mom, and everything in between in the 1950s and 60s. I would call this book a light-hitting book because it does hit some very hard topics. This book has a very descriptive rape scene. It deals with sexism and misogyny, death, suicide, and religious bigotry. There's a lot of really like hard-hitting topics, but all of that hardness was surrounded by very like lighthearted and warm characters. This book was very fast-paced and punchy and had witty dialogue and quite a bit of humor in it. So you didn't really have a chance to just like sit in the depressing stuff that came up in this book because it was so lighthearted and fun. This is also a very feminist heavy book about a very quirky character. She reminded me a lot of Molly the Maid. So I would compare those two books actually quite a bit in terms of like the character personality and some of the storyline of people taking advantage of her. And she just approaches situations in a very different way. Both books had a little bit of similar humor and also side characters who were older that ended up stepping in and helping the main character who is just like falling into bad luck with her life. My one main critique of this book, and I think it just, you know, was pushing into the feminist and like down with the patriarchy theme, was that every depiction of faith or religion in this book was seen as evil or wrong or just like religious bigotry or zealotry. Like, it was just seen as a bad thing. And yes, there's a lot of terrible, terrible things that people do in the name of religion, absolutely, but it just felt very like one-sided on the one message that like having any kind of faith is a bad thing. And so yeah, I guess that's my only personal problem with like, I wish that they had a little bit more of like evenness on that particular subject matter. Again, I didn't linger like too much on that, so it didn't like super take away from the story. I overall had a really fun time with this book and loved listening to the audiobook, flew through it. So far, definitely a standout in terms of historical fiction. I haven't read a historical fiction that I've loved yet, but this one's up there. All right, so that's my June wrap up. Thank you so much for sticking through and listening to me ramble on about the books that I read this month. I will see you in another video soon. Bye.